From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. A lot of people fall in love outside of their marriages. Some of them have affairs, some of them leave their wives or husbands. But not a lot of people are Agnes Callard. Agnes Callard did something truly unique. She fell in love with someone when she was seemingly happily married with 2 children. Okay, that part's not that unique. But then she told her husband, and they got divorced, sharing a single lawyer, in under 3 weeks. And then, well, then they all moved in together. I repeat, Agnes lives with her husband, her ex-husband, and their combined 3 sons. And by the way, they're all philosophy professors at the University of Chicago. The cherry on top of this strange situation is that she talks about all of it, a lot, and with radical openness and honesty, including in a truly unforgettable profile of her in The New Yorker called Agnes Callard's Marriage of the Minds. The philosopher, who lives with her husband and her ex-husband, searches for what one human can be to another human. Now, perhaps you hear all of this and think, this woman is a nut, or at the very least, a little too zany to relate to. But I beg to differ. There's just something about Agnes. Whether it's the result of her worldview, her natural predisposition, or her vocation as a philosopher, the upshot is that she has this tremendous ability to float above any situation, including the most intimate and personal, and philosophize it. When Agnes writes and speaks openly about her experiences, about falling in love while married, or how it unmoored her understanding of love and relationships, and how it forced her to examine her own life, she helps the rest of us, perhaps the more ordinary among us, make sense of the most universal topics and experiences. And I think it's actually quite an unusual gift. All of Agnes's experiences and her reflections on them became fodder for her new book, which is called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life, where she says we're not asking ourselves the most important questions about how we should live and how we might change. Today on Honestly, I ask Agnes Callard how and why she turned her life upside down for love, how she even knew it was love at all, how she examined her past marriage and her present one, how an examined life can benefit us all, and how and why we should all live a little bit more like her hero, Socrates. Stay with us. Agnes Callard, welcome to Honestly.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to open with a very simple question today, which is this. What is love?
Well, can we at least make it more specific, like to romantic love? There are a lot of different kinds of love. I think it gets more exciting if we specify the kind of love.
Okay, so let's specify. Let's say romantic love between 2 consenting adults to that love. Is that specific enough?
I mean, that raises an interesting question of what would romantic love between non-consenting adults look like. But that is, we're not talking about sex, we're talking about love, right?
Or it could go to, I said 2, I think, and it could be multiple.
It could be more, but also, can you consent to love? I kind of don't think so. So actually, I think there's no romantic love between consenting adults. I think romance and consent don't really work together, like sex and consent work together. I think that the experience of love, of falling in love, is very much the experience of something you didn't consent to, and often wouldn't have consented to if you could have had the opportunity to consent to it, right? It feels like it happens to you. It feels like you fall. You don't control it. So I don't think it's really in the sphere of consent. I think it is a relation to another person where we kind of ask them to be more than really one other person can ever be for us. That is, it's a kind of transcendent relation to another person. I think that it is, at least at moments or at its kind of highest passionate manifestation, it has a kind of aspirational character where we both idealize our partner and we feel ourselves to be in an ideal state in relation to them.
What is that ideal state if you could say a little bit more about what that looks like or feels like.
It's actually probably going to be different for different people, but it's like the best version of you, whatever that is. But I think that there's a sense of kind of almost like power and infinite possibility. I had this experience when I fell in love with my husband where I felt like the entire world had organized itself for our pleasure and enjoyment. Like I would be walking along the street and I would want a croissant and there'd be a croissant shop. Like there's this kind of magical quality.
A lot of people, I think, I'll speak for myself, have experienced romantic love as almost like physical illness. Like you can't eat, you can't sleep, you almost feel dizzy, lightheaded, almost sometimes even, I don't want to say nauseous, but it's like adjacent to the feeling of nausea. What do you think that is about? What is the relationship between love and illness, if there is one?
It's a great question. I think that relates to the thing that I was saying about transcendence. It's like you don't even fit in your body. Something doesn't fit about your life. You're experiencing something that's too big for the subject who's experiencing it. And it also takes over you in a way that illness does, right? So the contexts where we have an experience where we are, let's say, forced to attend to our bodies to the exclusion of everything else that we would usually care about, that's illness, usually. And so in that way, romantic love, which includes an erotic dimension and thus a bodily dimension, is going to resemble illness in the way that it commands our attention.
I think maybe it also resembles illness, to go back to the word consent that I stupidly used, in that you don't consent to the flu, and you also perhaps don't consent to romantic love. It's just something that overcomes you or overtakes you.
Right. And like, it might be that we do things, that we're more active in relation to love than we realize. Maybe we, behind the scenes, we're orchestrating whatever, but it's important to us to see it that way in any case, to see ourselves as very passive in relation to love. Maybe because it's important to ourselves to present ourselves to our partners that way.
Why is that?
Well, like somebody who is capable of a lot of machinations or control over the love relationship is an unappealing partner, right? Mm-hmm. So if you thought someone had orchestrated your falling in love with them, decided it, and decided to fall in love with you in addition, that would be off-putting, and I'm not sure why. But maybe, I mean, I think it's related to control battles. Like, there's a sense that, okay, here's a thing that happened to both of us versus a thing you decided and then you did it to me.
Agnes, you are a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. You are an expert in, among other things, ancient philosophy and ethics. And I think you've said that one of your first crushes was Immanuel Kant. I think perhaps today it's Socrates. But you first came on my radar, and I think on the radar of a lot of people who don't follow the philosophy department at the University of Chicago that closely, when you were profiled in The New Yorker. And to sort of summarize the premise of the story, and then I want to talk about the experience of it, because it has stayed with me ever since I read it, your experience. You were happily married to a man named Ben, who sounded pretty fantastic, Ben Callard, and then you fell in love with someone else. That is a story that has happened to many people throughout human history, but the way you respond to it and the way it played out, I think, is pretty exceptional. So before we get to that, and I think what it says about your mind, really, and the philosophical approach you have toward life and relationships and even something like romantic love, tell us about the origin of the story. Go back in time to when you're married to Ben, you have 2 young children, and as you explain, and I think it's a quote from the piece, you talk about how you fell in love with someone who was not your husband for the first time.
Yeah, I think So Arnold, who I'm married to now, was a student in an Aristotle seminar I was teaching. And he would come to office hours every week and we would talk about Aristotle. And the last week of the class was sort of the last office hours of the quarter. We were sitting in my office and we were talking about Aristotle's metaphysics, and he just had suddenly had a really weird look on his face. Like a look I didn't understand. And then at that, he told me, I said, what's up? And he told me that he was in love with me. And then at that moment, I realized I was in love with him too. And that was a huge shock. And at the time, at that moment, we decided, okay, but nothing can happen for a variety of reasons. There was me being married, and there was also him being a student. Indeed, my student at the university.
What does it mean to realize in a flash that you were in love with someone? Most people, especially women that I know, there's a pining for the person. It's not something that just sort of occurs to you that you're in love with someone.
Yeah.
Is that truly what it was? Looking back, when you look at the scope of your intellectual relationship, is it clear to you now that the signs of love were there? Or do you still experience that in hindsight as a flash of love?
There definitely were some indications. And I remember that a week or two before, I called my sister on the phone and been like, there's a student, who comes to talk to me, but I think there's something weird about it, or maybe it's inappropriate, or maybe there's something wrong. And she asked me questions. She's like, okay, well, under what context do you meet? And I'm like, well, in my office hours. And she's like, well, is he in a class? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, do you talk about the class material? I said, yeah. And she's like, do you talk about anything else? I said, no, we just talk about Aristotle. But there's something weird about it. And she's like, I think it's fine. And so that was a conversation that I remember having. So clearly I thought something was up, right? But that conversation also reveals my level of alienation from the situation. And I think that, probably if I hadn't been married and if he hadn't been my student, then I sort of would have been on the lookout for signs of attraction in ways that I wasn't. In fact, I was the opposite, right? I was, my attitude towards the situation was one that would have sought to downplay any such signs.
One of the things among many that is exceptional about a very ordinary story of falling in love with another person that isn't your spouse is the way that you handle it with your husband at the time. You basically say to him, here's what happened, and come to him and say, what should we do about it? And I feel that that is a very unique way to go about it. Tell me why you decided to do that, and how did he respond?
After this happened, I actually went home to my family with my kids. There was a trip we had planned anyway, to my parents' house, and there were lots of relatives there. And I brought this up with some of them, and they thought I might have gone crazy, actually, in need of mental health services, kind of crazy. And they also were like, whatever you do, don't talk about this with Ben. So that was there was a day, or not even a day of that. And I thought about it and I was like, no, that's crazy. I have to talk to Ben about this. I think because Ben was the person I was closest to in the world at that point, closer than to my family. And it would have felt like a horrible betrayal not to talk to him about it. Even if I, decided never to talk to Arnold again, I still would have to talk to Ben about it, because I'd otherwise be hiding this secret from him. And I genuinely didn't know what I should do. But Arnold, years later, came up with this kind of principle that I realized that I had sometimes been following anyway, which is something like, if you're in a very tricky situation, morally tricky, very, very unusual for you, your habits can't guide you, etc., then the thing to do is just be very open with everyone. Just lay yourself out on the table, and then people can help you. And I think that's, though I wouldn't have put it that way at the time, I think that's what was going on. I was like, I'm in a very tricky situation. I don't know what to do. I need help. The main person who can help me is Ben, but he can't help me if I don't tell him what's going on.
How did he respond?
So he we spent like one whole day walking around through. So basically what happened was I got up I realized I had to talk about him in person, and we're not in the same city. I was in New York, he was in Philadelphia. So like I got on a bus like at like 5 a.m. to Philadelphia. And we spent the entire day just like walking around Philadelphia talking. And I remember like at the very beginning, I was like kind of scared to tell him. I was like, I have to tell you something. And I was scared, like my voice was shaking. And he was so sort of empathetic about that. And he was like, look, whatever you have to tell me, you can just tell me. But he said it in a way where I really believed it. I really believed that whatever I had to tell him, he would sort of respond, okay. And you might think like, okay, but he wasn't thinking about what I might say, right? If he knew what I might say to him, then he maybe wouldn't be so cavalier and being like, whatever you have to say, you can say it. But it turned out to be true. Like he didn't respond in an angry or defensive way at all at that time. But his basic line of thought was like, yeah, but we have a good marriage and we have kids and we should figure out a way to work this out. Maybe we go to therapy, whatever. And I agreed. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So, we talked it through every day, and that's the conclusion that we came to. And I went back to New York. And then he called me the next morning, I believe this is the timing. And he was like, no, I realized that you were right and we actually should get divorced.
Okay, I want to pause you. Most people are going to hear that and they're going to say, how is that possible? Like, how is it possible that, like, what was the nature of marriage, especially with children, that you could just say, hey, this other person told me he was in love with me. In a flash, I realized I'm in love with him too. And within 24 hours of bringing it up to your husband, it's done. And then to sort of fast forward the story, you guys are divorced within something like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You didn't even hire separate lawyers.
No, we had the same lawyer. Yeah. And told us that was really, really bad. She was like, please don't do this. We're like, it's going to be fine.
I think one of the reasons that people are fascinated with this story is because it makes you think. It's a little bit like talking about love. Everyone's experience of love is different. Everyone's experience of doubt is different. I experienced this before. I was briefly married before I was married to Nellie. And sort of like you, I think I have sort of similar inclinations. When I'm so unsure about something, I tell everybody and I lay it all out on the table. And before I got married, I said to everyone, including the person I was about to marry, I don't know if this is the right thing. I'm having all kinds of feelings. And I went to everyone that I trusted that it seemed like they were in a good marriage and said to them, are these feelings normal? Is it normal to feel doubt? And they basically all of their advice collectively like got me down the wedding aisle, because what they told me is doubt is normal. Doubt is normal. Of course, everyone has doubt. And I basically said to myself, well, everyone's telling me it's normal. I'm feeling doubt. But what was missing in that is what doubt actually means for a person. In the same way that I think love can mean really different things or marriage can mean really different things. And I bring that all up because only in retrospect did I understand like that those words contain very different meanings for people. And a little bit I had that feeling reading about your story that I was like, is she in a marriage? Does she have a different understanding of marriage than I do? And also a different maybe understanding of what love is, because you clearly admire, respect, I would say loved Ben. But the love or the quality of the love was different. And I really want to just drill down on that, because the idea that you would upend your whole life and know somewhere deep inside that it was correct to upend it, you're still married to Arnold, and that this wasn't just like a passing fever is fascinating to me. And I want you to try and describe the differences in love between the first marriage and the second marriage and how you knew that this was worth upending your whole life for. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but and I definitely felt at the time like I knew, and it certainly worked out. But I'm not sure now I want to say that I really knew. I think I think one thing about life is that everything can change in a minute. That's just a general truth about life. So you might, anyone could die at any moment, and then it just happens really suddenly and you have to move on. And The real question is how are you going to deal with it? How are you going to move on? How are you going to put your life together when something very shocking hits it very suddenly? Because it will. And so the way that like Ben and I experienced this was something like a very shocking thing happened to us. And like there's a level on which I think you're right that you know, what I had and have with Ben is still a kind of love. I think Ben and I have an eternal bond, as is evidenced by the fact that we still live together. And like this year, we forgot to celebrate our divorce anniversary, and Ben, like a couple days ago, said to me, "Hey, we should do something about our divorce anniversary." And like a couple of minutes before we started this interview, Ben and I were talking about the Turing test and arguing over our different interpretations of the Turing test. So
pause. You still live together?
Yes, we do still live together.
Explain that to me.
Ben and I got divorced shortly after the events that I described, which were in 2011. And then maybe a year later, at the time, I moved out of the house and I moved in with Arnold, like maybe a month later or something like that. And then something like a year and a half, 2 years later, we all decided to live together. And this was sort of on the basis of two things. So one of them is, I don't think it would have even occurred to us to do this immediately. But we just found we all got along. Like Ben and I had an arrangement where, let's say, I would have the kids on Saturday and he would have them on Sunday. And on Saturday night, when I would be making dinner for the kids and Arnold, he would come over and have dinner with us, and when he was like his night off, he would choose to like hang out with us. And we were doing that often enough and we got along. We all like learned that we just got along as a group. That's one part. And the other part was that I then became pregnant. And this is now I'm already married to Arnold, with my third kid. And, I think the best thing you can give your kid is siblings. Like that's the greatest gift you can. Well, the first greatest gift is life. Okay, life. Then the second is siblings. And it was really important to me, if possible, that this third kid be allowed to have the kind of, but be allowed to have brothers. Have the kind of bond that I think you really are most likely to have with people if you live with them. And so we decided to try it out, like for a year. What would happen if we all lived together? And now it's like, that was maybe like 2013. So we've been living together for 12 years. And it really worked about the siblings thing. Like my youngest is, there's no difference between them brothers wise, I would say.
Not many men would be okay with this situation, specifically that Ben is in, although I guess Arnold too. I think the notable thing is not just the unusual situation. It's that the three of you are all philosophers at the University of Chicago Philosophy Department. So you all work together too, right?
Yes, that is true. That's true. In fact, this conversation that I just described between me and Ben about Turing was in Arnold's office because Arnold was making us all coffee because he has the coffee apparatus in his office. So Arnold was there too. But
explain, Agnes, how does the study of philosophy inform the way this story unfolds and is unfolding? Like, I do think there's something about, I don't know, maybe Socrates himself, or like there's something about the mind space that you all inhabit that I think has allowed you to do something that for most people would seem absolutely emotionally impossible.
I think that philosophy is kind of training in pushing the boundaries of what we can talk about. And in like learning to articulate things that you might have thought could go without saying. So like the fight that Ben and I were just having about Turing was, Ben interprets Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which is like, maybe one of the most discussed papers in the whole history of philosophy, and is kind of this paper that sort of spawned philosophical thinking about AI. Ben interprets Turing as a behaviorist. So he says, look, Turing as a kind of verificationist, someone who's like, well, you count as thinking if you pass a certain test. Namely, you can convince another person in a conversation that you're a human being talking to them. And that's what thinking is. Thinking is passing that test. That is, to think is to be able to provide a certain kind of experience or output for another person. And there are some famous philosophical arguments against that position, responses to Turing. And I was like, what if Turing wasn't saying that? What if he was just saying, this is a sign of thinking, and this is a correlate of thinking, or this is evidence for thinking. And he just wasn't. And then Ben's like, well, but then he has to give an account of what thinking is, and he doesn't do that. And I'm like, what if he doesn't care? And Ben's like, well, no, you can't just have, say, this is a correlate of this, and then not explain what the this is. He couldn't possibly do that. And I'm like, I think he could do it, because Turing wasn't a philosopher. And it might just not have occurred to him that he had to define the word thinking. That is, he might have thought, look, we all know what thinking is. Here's a sign of it. We all have some common sense understanding of it. I'm not going to try to define it. I'm not going to try to give you necessary and sufficient conditions. I'm just going to give you a correlate of it, which is passing this test, right? Okay, so basically, Ben and I were arguing over whether Turing was a philosopher. And I was like, he's not really a philosopher. And so don't attribute to him this complex philosophical position. But the point is, if he were a philosopher, he would think, no, you got to define thinking. And that's how Ben and Arnold and I are. We're like in the you have to define thinking club.
Okay. In the you have to define thinking club, I think part of what this whole story has left me with since I've read it is the question, what is love? And also, what is marriage? Explain what marriage is to you, Agnes Callard. Because I want to just add one thing, which is most people, when you were telling them about this flash of love with this student in your office hours, were, dude, keep it from your husband. Like, have an affair, do the normal thing,
Exactly.
or like ask for an open marriage. You decided not to do that, which I think reflects something you think about what marriage is.
I think it reflects something about, actually more generally, about what I think life is. But I was...
Okay, let's start there.
Recently, like in the past few months, I've gotten really into this like slightly obscure American sociologist named Harvey Sachs, who died when he was 40. So he didn't leave a lot of work behind, but what he left behind were basically his lectures, his students. It's like 1,500 pages of lectures, and I've been reading those. And he's someone who's interested in conversation and like what actually happens in a conversation, looking at transcripts. And kind of noticing the microstructure of conversation and trying to use it to read like what is human interaction. One thing that he noticed is that we are always what he called being ordinary. That is, we are performing being ordinary for other people in order for them to understand what it is that we are. We have to relate as ordinary people. And it might be as ordinary intellectuals or as ordinary firemen or as ordinary whatever we are, right? Ordinary women. That he's like, when, if you have an experience, even if you have an unusual experience, you saw a car crash on your way to work or something, what he does is he brings out how people try to have the ordinary experience of the car crash, right? He's like, here's what you're not going to do. You're not going to describe the 12 different shades of blue that the glass on the ground had. You're not allowed to. That's an experience you're not allowed to have of the car crash. You have to be like, oh, it's terrible. I hope everyone is okay. Like, I can tell you without having had this experience, what experience you're allowed to have of the car crash. So I think that part of the benefit of opening a lot of parts of your life up to articulation and inquiry is that you get to do a little bit less of being ordinary. You still have to be pretty ordinary, but you get like a little bit more freedom. I think marriage. So Arnold said a great thing. He keeps correcting me because I keep thinking I said it in the conversation with Rachel, but he has a better memory, so I believe him that he said it. But he was channeling me, that is, he was expressing my view, which he often does. Marriage is a preparation for divorce. That's what marriage is. And what I think, like, I thought, like, when he said it, I was immediately like, yes, that's exactly right. And the way I interpret that is something like, any married couple might have to get divorced. That is, it could just happen. Stuff could happen to you, no matter how much you love each other or how well it's going. Stuff could happen to you where you have to get divorced. And then the question is, how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to navigate it? Are you going to become like nasty and cruel to one another? Is that what your love is? Because if that's what your love, if that's what's going to happen, that's already true now. So there's this divorce test, and you may never face it. You may get lucky that you don't face the circumstances in which you have to get divorced. But it's like I don't think this is a definition. This is not yet a definition. It's just a correlate. But I think that Arnold was thinking it's kind of criterial on a good marriage that when you are in some sense angry with each other and in some sense fighting and in the kind of worst possible circumstances for getting along and for liking each other, that you're still able to be kind and fair and just and considerate, and you are not cruel in those circumstances. That's what it is to really love a person.
Do you think that divorce is a failure?
Kind of, in the sense in which, let's say, quitting a grad program is a failure. Like you might be getting your PhD in something, right? And then this is a conversation I'm in, like, not infrequently with students.
Of course.
Like, should I continue? Should I? I was in it, right? I considered leaving grad school, and there's a sense in which the kind of normative structure that you're in is one where it dictates like what success is at that particular game, at the game of marriage. But then there's a question, okay, but should you be playing that game? Mm-hmm. And so I think that deciding that you don't want to play that game anymore is going to count as a failure within the game. That's true. It's kind of like if you're playing a board game, right, with a bunch of people, and you decided to stop playing. Well, they're not going to count you as winning. In fact, they're going to count you as you're out now. You've lost, right? Yeah. In that sense, you've lost. But only in that. So only in that limited sense.
In the piece, in the New Yorker piece, you talk about being very upset at the idea that divorce would harm your sons. But you felt that the alternative is that you would become a bad person. And here I'm quoting you. I thought that I would become sort of corrupted by staying in a marriage where I no longer felt like I was aspirational about it. I want you to explain what aspirational means, because it's a word and an idea that comes up a lot in your work. How do you know if you're being aspirational? Like, explain what you mean by that word.
Not so long after I got divorced, I ended up writing a book on aspiration. And as something where I thought a phenomenon that philosophers had failed to theorize. And as a kind of general point, given that my general view of what philosophy is, of the point of philosophy, is just that for everything we do in our lives, if we knew what we were doing, we would do it better. And so philosophy is like the attempt to do that, to like tell you what is it that you're doing when you're thinking? What is it that you're doing when you're aspiring? Because if you are aspiring and you know what you're doing, you'll do it better. Okay. So I think I didn't quite know at the time what it was that I was doing, but so that's part of why I was motivated to then work on that topic. I think that aspiring is trying to acquire new values. That is, so the definition I give in my book is that it's the rational process of value acquisition. So trying is important because I think there's stuff that can just happen to you, and then there's stuff that you do. And I think aspiration is something you do. And it's sort of like I had this sense that I haven't yet quite figured out the person who I am. I haven't gotten like a firm grip on her. And if I were to stay in this marriage, that process I can now see would be arrested.
Was there no way for you to become aspirational again in the original marriage?
There might have been. So this is just what I experienced, right?
Right.
But it's like I got an invitation, And the question is, do I pass up this invitation? And am I going to get more such invitations in the future in other forms? Maybe. Probably, actually. That is, I think that the thing that I didn't really understand about myself when I, you know, got divorced from Ben was just how aspirational a person I am. That is, I think I would have probably found other avenues.
Say more about that, because to me, it's a little bit like the way, not to sound like too fatalistic, but I sort of have come to the view that people have like a happiness set point a little bit, and people also have like an ambition set point. And I don't know why, and I don't know where it comes from, but I just noticed that. And maybe we also have aspiration set points. Do you think that that's kind of true?
It's so hard to know. Like what? So I think a thing that happened after I, got together with Arnold, is, I over the course of the next, say, 5 years, my understanding of my place in the world changed a lot. Namely, I went from being a regular old private philosopher to a public philosopher.
Was that connected to the
So this
change
is what I
in
do.
marriage?
Also, my office, like, which I guess this is. Is the video going to show on this or just the audio?
For the people watching the video, they'll see it. But for the people that aren't, you should know that Agnes Callard is sort of known for her very vibrant wardrobe choices, unlike yours truly, and that the wall behind her is like a Marimekko, multicolored 70s-esque vibe. And she's sort of blending in with the wallpaper right now with her shirt.
I think you can see, if you look carefully, my yarn tree. I have a tree that I got it was like Restoration Hardware discount after Christmas, and I covered it with yarn. I was actually going to make a yarn tree forest. I was going to have like 10 of them, but it took me like 6 months to make one yarn tree. So anyway, so my office didn't look like this. It looked like a regular office. And my clothing was not the clothing I had. Like everything kind of changed. And
what did you used to? Wait, I'm very curious about this. What did you used to wear?
So my clothing choices have been, it's been like a roller coaster throughout my life since like elementary school. And so I've gotten into phases. But I think I dressed just much more like when I got this job at the University of Chicago, I thought, okay, well, I need to dress like a professor.
Right. Like what I'm seeing right now is the opposite of serious professor.
Yeah.
I'm seeing like Miss Frizzle vibes.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good description. My sister calls it giant kindergartner.
Right.
So I think like, I just took my cues for how to dress from the people around me. And I also took my cues for how my office should look from the people around me, right? I looked at the other offices. My office looked like their offices. There's just been a lot of avenues of development. And, maybe if I had stayed with Ben, I would have done none of them, but that's hard to believe. It's hard for me to believe.
I think the thing that is, so the way I think a ordinary or a performing ordinary woman would describe the emotions you felt, who maybe wasn't a professional philosopher, would say like, I was held back in my old marriage. Now I'm in this new marriage and I can fully be myself. Those would be sort of the ordinary ways to describe this situation. What I've wanted to ask you is, I think I don't know, I grew up in like second wave feminist vibe world, like would be, wait, that's crazy. Like you don't need a marriage to unlock your own ambitions and your own public aspirations. Like you go, girl, like girl boss it up, Agnes. If you want to be a public philosopher, like getting into fights on Twitter, you can do that no matter who you're married to. And so in a way, I think you're implicitly making the case for maybe something more traditional, which is like the person you marry is actually the most important decision that you make and will unlock a lot of things for you, professionally or not. What do you say to that?
I think that that's true. I think I do think so. I think something even we can go one level up. So I we'll eventually talk about my new book, Open Socrates, which is a defense of the claim that thinking is not something you do by yourself. So there's the idea, oh, well, you can just do whatever you choose to do. You can just liberate yourself or something like that. And I don't think that's right. I think that we are at a very deep level social creatures, and our sense of possibility is partly bounded by the people around us. And I think, there's just a good chance that if I hadn't met Ben, I wouldn't have stayed in philosophy. Like, that is my whole dissertation I wrote by talking through every line, every idea with him. A big part of what I am as a philosopher is like Ben's product. And
Whoa, say more.
Well, so I think that I'm someone who is, or at least was, bad at clearly saying what I think. That's something I was very bad at in grad school. I later learned that people would like talk about me behind my back as like the crazy girl, the classicist, because I was in classics before I was in philosophy, and I was like an interloper, right? And like where no one ever understands what she says in class. And she always has like a question or a comment, but like no one gets what she's saying. And I think they were being fair. Like that was true. And it's taken me a very long time to make myself intelligible. And a lot of that was Ben's work. It was him kind of with his infinite patience, just being like, okay, are you saying this or are you saying this? Here's a distinction that you seem to be conflating, or you seem to be trying to have it both ways. He often is telling me that I'm trying to have something both ways. I'm often trying to assert contradictions, and Ben.
Well, the story of your personal life is the ultimate having it both ways. You live with your ex-husband and your present husband.
Right. But so one thing that's interesting, if you are a philosopher and you're attuned to contradictions, is that you notice what people ordinarily take for contradictions that are actually not at all contradictory. So like living with your ex-husband and your current husband, that's actually not a contradiction. It's raining and it's not raining. That's a contradiction. That you really can't get around that one. That's just it's not going to happen. But the husband, the ex-husband, that actually can happen. So I think that's a really interesting part of the being ordinary thing, is that we mistake social space for logical space. And so things seem impossible to us that are really very far from impossible. And part of why we relegate them into the domain of impossibility is that we don't feel like we'd be capable of adjudicating the social interactions that would sort of make their possibility visible.
One of the things that you talk about in this story about what the Arnold relationship opened up to you, and you say, I could completely change now. Radical change, becoming a wholly other person, is not out of the question. There's suddenly room for massive aspiration. Do you think that most of us sort of secretly desire to become wholly other people? Because I think what struck me in reading that is like, that is a feeling, the feeling of I could completely change, like the feeling of I can feel true love, know what it is to be loved, and I can't resist that. That seems to me more comprehensible than I could radically become a wholly other person. So tell me what you mean by that.
I think that the only way that I could sort of allow even the possibility of this relationship to like enter into my conceptual space was to think, this is more than me just trading one set of affections for another set of affections. Like, if that's all I'm doing, I shouldn't do that. And so there's some bigger issue at stake. And the bigger issue is something like who we all are, these three people, me and Ben and Arnold. And that there's a cost to trying to preserve something, trying to preserve a relationship in a kind of against the gravity of like where it's trying to go, to trying to keep it somewhere that it kind of ossifies. And it wouldn't just be me, it would also be Ben, ending up kind of stuck. So I think that many people would not resonate with the idea of wanting to become a wholly other person. Like that's not as I said, I
It's
didn't
not a
understand.
thing.
That's not a thing. Like that, I'm just more aspirational than most people are. There's some kind of a spectrum. I also think like this is just I have not no research or anything, but I think it's a little bit gendered. Like I think women tend to be somewhat more aspirational than men.
You do?
Yeah.
Do you think that's why women initiate more divorces? Do you know the highest rate of divorce is among lesbians, which Nellie likes to remind me? And it makes sense because I think women...
Because both sides...
both sides are more...
the
negative way to say it is more easily dissatisfied. The positive way to say it, I guess, is more aspirational. Another language that might be helpful for people that are unfamiliar with aspirational, and they should go and read your book, is the idea of like a satisfizer versus a maximizer. And I think women tend to be more maximizing than men, as a rule. I don't know if you agree with that.
So I think that that's not a bad gloss, but maximizing suggests what I call ambition in my book. Namely, you could have a pretty clear conception of who you want to be. Like you want to have such and such net worth, or you want to have this job or this level of power or whatever, and you're working to achieve that thing. And that might be something very high that takes like a lot of, might want the maximum amount of power or a ton of wealth or whatever. But the difference is that when you're aspiring, you actually don't have a super clear idea of like where you're going and what it is you're trying to get, because what you're trying to learn is actually the value that you will have at the end of this process. And so like one way to think about it was, and I'm not sure this is right, but it would be a clarifying example. Something like, I wanted to become a public intellectual, but I didn't know that. I didn't even know what that was. It wasn't yet really on my radar. I only had this inkling that my intellectual life was somehow constrained as it was, and I need to think about things in a slightly more open way. And I had this sense that Arnold could help me do that. And at the end of the story, I can say, okay, this was the beginning of that. But at the beginning of the story, you don't know what it's a beginning of.
But I think because of your philosophical framework and frankly, because of your work in Socratic method and other things, you had a more interconnected idea of going back to my feminist question, like do it on your own. Like, I think you had a different relationship to the question of how you become the thing you want to become. Like, it's not something that you go into a room and do on your own.
Yeah.
It's something that you can only do in a relationship with many people, often.
Right. So, like, this relates to feminism. Like, I think the main thing that traps almost everybody is themselves. That is, we're not trapped by social forces. We're trapped by the social forces that we've internalized, which is a lot of social forces. So the oppression is coming from inside the house of our mind. And I think that, what sounds sort of unappealing about that is it sounds like victim blaming, and in a way it is a bit. But you can sort of say, look, I wouldn't have internalized the structures in that way if I hadn't been in whatever environment I'm in. So the ultimate cause can still be the environment. But the point is that the way it locally functions is that I see the world in the light of the oppressive structures, or more generally just the kind of forced ordinariness that I've internalized. And so I just don't have the resources inside of me to turn this whole thing around. So, I think that there's a way in which my point of view is very deeply shaped by the kind of critique of Enlightenment individualism that you get in some way all post-Kantian thinkers are starting to think in that way, but someone like Foucault, it may be a recognizable name. The thought that we have an image of ourselves as autonomous, rational thinkers that's inherited from the Enlightenment. That's not really right. We're just not as powerful as that. We're not very good at thinking. We're not very good at figuring out what we want. And we mostly tend to reflect the people around us and what would please them. And so, yeah, surrounding yourself with the right people is big.
If you're coming from a framework where one understands that you require other people to become not just most fully yourself, and that you can't do that alone, perhaps the romantic love relationship is like the pinnacle example of that. And you say something in the New Yorker story where you say, two people want to be loved because neither of them is happy with who he or she is. Do you still think that's true, however many years later after you said that?
Totally. Yeah. I think that we don't really want to be loved for who we are. We want to be loved for like who we could be, where that's a function of who we are. It's not unrelated. But I think it's important to me that that I'm not allowed to get away with things. That so many interactions in life just have to be a matter of one person placating another. Like that's the way life goes. We have a lot of relationships where we have to maintain in some way the kind of civility or professional character or friendliness of the relationship. And so we placate one another. And it's important to me to have at least some relationships where that aspect is minimized.
One of the things that you've talked about, and you and Arnold have talked a lot about your marriage, is you describe a system where you guys are sort of constantly re-examining the marriage. Tell us practically, for those of us who are like, damn, like I'm a hero for just getting my kids into bed and like getting dinner on the table. The best possible outcome of this night is that we're watching The Pit on Netflix, which is a great show, by the way. The idea of like having even the bandwidth to re-examine your marriage, like what does that actually look like?
It's interesting to me how often I get the kind of exhaustion line. Like a response that I get a lot is like, you seem very exhausting, or like, you're asking a lot of people. And
I think you seem extraordinarily energized. That's why I want to understand the secret.
Well, but what I mean is, it's like when I say things like, in my book, I talk about how we could live more philosophically, or let's say how we could examine our marriages or whatever, people immediately go to their moments of maximum exhaustion and they're like, you want me to do it then? And it's like, no, it's not then that you have to do it. Is it really true that every single second of your life is taken up with things that you absolutely have to do and you have no choice at all? So like, okay, here's an example. And I did a night owls event in which I asked my interlocutor, like, why do people find this so weird? Okay, when my husband and I go out to dinner, I often make a conversation menu. Like I will, before the dinner, I'll like write up a list of like, here are possible conversations we could have during this dinner.
I love this. Will you email this list or will you bring it printed out to the dinner?
So I've done several things, like put it on my phone as like, just like a, right in my,
like a notes app.
Yeah, except I just do it in an email. But also like handwritten. There's a number of them that I just hand wrote. So the thing is, like, I tried this with someone else, and it went really badly. And Arnold, and I often suggest it. Like I tell Arnold, like I'm thinking of doing the conversation menu thing with someone else, and he's always like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that with other people. It's like super offensive. And
why is it offensive? I think it's because I think it's so thoughtful. Meaning, most like you're putting. It's just showing a level of intention and I think thoughtfulness. I mean, I think what could be alienating is if I'm going to dinner with you and you're saying, let's talk about whether Socrates or Nietzsche or whoever is right about revenge. And I'm like, I don't know jack shit about those topics, Agnes. Like, meet me on my level.
Right. No, so like, for instance, the one, like, they're always like tailored to like what that other person would be interested in. But also, so like Arnold will be like, people... I asked the social psychologist with whom I did an event this question, okay? Why are people put off by conversation menus? He's an expert on conversation. And he said, it seems like you don't trust the person that you're having dinner with, that you don't trust that the conversation would go to interesting places. You don't trust it on its own. And I'm like, that's completely true. I do not. I think that most conversations don't go anywhere because people don't take any effort to make them go anywhere. And so they just chat for a long time and nobody even remembers what it was about. And then, a thing that I get from people is, like, I don't trust myself either. It's not just that I don't trust them. Is, well, you're not like giving the other person control, or like, and I always say, like, I'm happy to add any items to the menu that the other person wants. Like, the menu stands open, we can add to it. I'm just providing some things, right? But so yeah, there can be, sometimes we'll like just agree without writing anything down. Like Arnold and I will agree, like, here are two things that we could talk about. But anyway, in terms of like, what is it to, manage your marriage philosophically? Maybe that goes on the list.
The menu conversation.
The conversation menu.
Conversation menu. But other things too. I guess what I'm wondering, here's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
When I read this story, I thought, like, she did the thing. Like, she got struck by lightning, fell in love, decided to take the leap, which most people don't do. And inevitably, at some point, she's going to look around at her life and be like, well, different person, different set of problems. But I wonder if that's actually true, in part because what I've always have found strange about the Ben chapter of your life is that you're married to a philosopher. You examine the crap out of everything, even the word thinking. Mm-hmm. And yet it seemed like you were in a pretty unexamined marriage. And now you're in one that is constantly being turned over again and again. Looking back, do you think if you had applied some of the principles that you have in your marriage with Arnold, or the values, you'll tell me what word is correct, to your marriage with Ben, you could have found aspiration again there?
I think probably yes. But, that I did it was not, Arnold's not irrelevant to the story of my being motivated to do that. But I also think, like, it's like, could I look around and say, different set of problems, like, on some level, yeah, but like my set of problems now include another person. In fact, another two people, because we got Arnold and Izzy, right? So obviously I got more problems, and more people is more problems. But I think that maybe it is important to how this story has played out. And I don't know that I could have predicted that it would play out this way, but it's important to how the story has played out that, my relationship with Ben didn't just poof out of existence. And there really was immense social pressure for that to happen. Like, of all the times I've experienced social pressure in my life, this would be, and resisted it, let's say, because most of the social pressure I just bow to without even noticing, right? That's what the nature of social pressure is. But the kinds that I've resisted, it was like at the level of people being like, look, you have to separate your bank accounts immediately. And these were people who, like, the week before were like, you can't get a divorce. Like, but then it was like, you have to separate, like, you can't talk to him. You shouldn't see each other at all. Like, you shouldn't talk to each other. And I got a lot of that kind of advice from friends and relatives that, like, okay, if you're going to get divorced, you got to,
cut it off.
It's like he's dead to you. Yeah. Maybe you negotiate about the children, but like minimal. And I kind of do see how if you approached, divorce that way, then it would be like, well, here's another person that you've put into the same role and you're still the same. And so you may end up in many of the same predicaments that you did before. Maybe it would be like if you just switched jobs or something for like a kind of similar job. The personality problems in you that created problems with that job are still there. You're taking them with you.
By now, I hope that those who have never encountered the mind of Agnes Callard are aware of how unusual and unique she is. And much of that can be found, those qualities, I should say, can be found in her new book, which is called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life. And I would argue, I don't know if this is a verb, but you've Socratized your life. You have done that. You continue to do that. A colleague of yours once said that you approach every conversation as if it were integral to your life's work. I think the conversation menu being just one example. So, Agnes, for those people who are vaguely aware of Socrates who vaguely aware of the Socratic method, who know that he lived in Athens, he was killed, for the hemlock. Crazy story. People can go and read it. But for the purposes of this conversation, what does it mean to live in accordance with Socratic teaching?
So I think it is to live your life not as though you know how to live it, but as though you're still figuring that out. I don't think I've ever met anyone who, as far as I could tell, had knowledge of how to live their life. Maybe some people secretly had it, but they didn't share it with me. So it would be very rude. On the other hand, I don't think I've ever met anyone who can really fully, deeply accept that fact. That is, we're all Randians in a lot of ways. We all succumb to the illusion of power and independence and, a kind of pride of preserving one's dignity and being able to stand up for oneself, something like that. So I think we're all caught in the same predicament. And maybe what it is to be a Socratic is just to try to remind yourself as well as possible, like, it's both that you need other people, but also how you need them. That is, you need them for something kind of specific. And I think that we can very easily get caught up with sort of the project of maintaining positive social relations without really getting what they're for. That is, you want to be likable and you want people to want to talk to you so that you can talk to them about things that matter. If you're not going to do that, it doesn't matter whether you're likable. Like, that they like you doesn't matter if they're not going to make use of it. So it's there's something kind of instrumental there.
You make the case that Socrates says that all problems are fundamentally problems of ignorance. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Okay. And basically that we can be less ignorant through inquiry and questioning and therefore get to a happier life. I think my issue with this is that many of the happiest people I know are the people that examine their lives the least. Help square that for me. Tell me why the examined life, the obsessively examined life, the questioned life is a happier one.
One of the objections that I get a lot to this book, someone will say to me, look, I have a friend, and my friend was like an ordinary, happy, whatever guy. And then one day he got into philosophy and he started to spend all his time in his room, like scribbling in notebooks and like examining his life. And he became more and more depressed and eventually had to go on antidepressants and was like, miserable. And philosophy ruined his life. Is that what you want me to do? Do you want me to become that guy? And what I tell people is that there's a version of the story that no one has ever told me. No one ever told me, I had this friend and he got really into philosophy and he got all of the people around him into philosophy too. And they started to have all of these really active, really engaged conversations about like, what's the meaning of life and, what did Turing really mean, et cetera. And then they all were just miserable about this and unhappy and depressed. So that story has never been told to me. I've never heard any version of that story. I think that a lot of people live their lives pretty well because they got lucky and they kind of stumbled on a pretty good set of principles and then they stuck to those principles. They don't actually know why those are good or why it's the right way to live. It's awesome if you can be lucky. I mean, I'm not putting that down. That's great for them. But I think that what we, and here I sort of mean humanity, what we want is something a little better than luck. That is something which is a little more systematic and a little more subject to our agency in terms of figuring out whether we're living in the way that we should be living. And so if there's some people who are perfectly happy with how they're living, and that's great, but it doesn't follow that if you're not and you just don't examine your life, you'll become like them, right? You maybe didn't stumble on those things that they stumbled onto. I want to say one other thing, which I think is just useful for, when you say they're happy, it could mean a bunch of different things. But
I guess let me underline what I mean. I think people that have a philosophical inclination, and I don't know anyone that is at the end of the spectrum in the way you are, but closer to you, they might have a more meaningful life. But I make a big distinction between meaning and happiness.
Okay, that's helpful.
And like for me, meaning is the thing, like that is the thing I chase. And that brings me a tremendous amount of satisfaction and maybe you could say joy, but it's different than happy.
Good.
Is that, and maybe I'm using those words incorrectly, but for me, they're really different things.
Yeah. So one of the things in my book that I tried to do is to sort of explain why, when you're ignorant, the good fractures for you into these multiple concepts like, well, there's what's just, and there's what's prudent, and there's what's noble, and there's what's meaningful, and there's what makes me happy. And but that if you had knowledge, those things would actually all fuse together. So it's not, I too am inclined to draw those distinctions. But here's like a way that I have of thinking about it, of thinking about why you might want meaning. If what meaning is something like it comes packaged with at least some grip on why the thing that you're experiencing is positive or good. It's that, like, imagine you could live the rest of your life exactly how you would otherwise, except you wouldn't have any consciousness. So you wouldn't, there'd be no one awake in there. You would appear to others exactly the same. So the people who said about you, Barry seems pretty happy, they would still say that about you because you would be behaving in all the same ways you would have, right? But you wouldn't be experiencing anything. Okay. So when I ask people like, okay, suppose you could live that life versus the life you're going to live. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants zombie life. Even though they would give all these same outward signs and all the same people would say that they're happy. Why not? Well, the answer is that they would say that wouldn't really be my life. I mean, I wouldn't be living. I would be appearing to live, but I wouldn't somehow own it. It wouldn't be attached to me. It wouldn't be mine. So I think Socrates just thinks all of that holds for knowledge. That is, going through your life kind of stumbling around, accidentally happening upon good ways of doing things where you don't understand why they're good, that's kind of like being a zombie inside your own life. And that in questing for meaning and for understanding and for examination, what we're trying to do is kind of grab ownership of our lives so that whatever happiness takes place in them is our happiness.
Last question. You've said in an interview that your reputation, anyone's reputation, is something that exists in the minds of other people, which just seems obviously true, but hadn't thought about it that way. What's something, Agnes Callard, that people misperceive or get wrong about you?
I think it's the same thing that people misperceived about Socrates. Namely, they often think that I'm, trolling or being ironic or aiming to elicit a kind of outraged response. Where that picture of me is somehow a kind of incredulity. It's like she couldn't possibly be for real. This couldn't actually be who she is. Callicles says that about Socrates in the Gorgias. Is like, he isn't for real, is he? He says to somebody else, like, this isn't really happening. It's something, it appears to be this, but actually the reality is something else. There's some kind of other reality behind the appearance. And I think it's like I'm actually a much more superficial person than people realize. Like, this is me. I'm pretty much, even just at the level of speech. So if you think about my speech patterns in this conversation, this is also how I talk to my kids in front of a classroom. If I'm giving a lecture, most people actually have different speech patterns that they can adopt in different contexts, so that, like, I get the response a lot on podcasts, like, is she a teenager? Why does she talk like that? But I don't have the ability to modulate it in different contexts. And so, like, I don't have a lot of hidden depths. I think that's one of the things people are misunderstanding about me, is that whatever you see, that's the real thing. That's sort of the product of putting yourself out there, is then you're out there and that's who you really are. And there's not very much of a hidden agenda, because if I had one, I'd actually be motivated to put it out there so that I could be corrected on it.
Agnes Callard, I could talk to you for hours. I think talking to you is a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me.
It was my pleasure. I really liked it.